6 days after my 61st birthday, a corporate lawyer called and asked whether I recognized my own electronic signature on a consent form I had never seen. That was the third surprise. The first had happened at dinner, when my brother-in-law pushed a blue folder across the table and told me, in front of 26 relatives and friends, to give my sister the voting shares my father had left me. The second came when I answered him with 3 words. Workers own it. Preston Holt had been reaching for his wine glass. His hand stopped in the air. My sister stared at me as if I had announced that the building was on fire. 2 cousins looked down at their plates. The restaurant manager, who had been hovering near the door with a birthday cake, quietly backed into the hall. What nobody at that table knew was that Preston had already promised those shares, along with nearly $17 million worth of land and machine tools, to a private lender. He had promised property he did not own to secure a rescue loan for a company that was 45 days from missing a payment he had personally guaranteed. He had also used a scanned version of my signature to make the promise look real. I did not know all of that when I spoke those 3 words. I knew only that a man who had spent 15 years treating my father's factory like a future inheritance had suddenly gone pale when he learned the inheritance was no longer available. Before I tell you how a family birthday dinner turned into a lender fraud review, tell me where you are listening from and whether you have ever watched someone spend money that was not theirs yet. Stories like this look different in every family, but the warning signs are remarkably alike. My name is Caleb Rowan. I am 61 years old, and I spent 34 years in the United States Army. Most of that time was in acquisition and logistics, which is a polite way of saying I made a career out of reading promises, checking what stood behind them, and asking uncomfortable questions before public money disappeared into private excuses. I retired as a colonel 4 years before that dinner. By then, I had worked with everything from truck parts to communication systems. I had sat across tables from contractors who could explain a 6-month delay with a 50-slide presentation and never once used the word failure. I learned to listen for what people avoided. I learned that urgency is often a disguise worn by poor planning. I learned that a clean signature page can hide a dirty transaction. Those lessons served the Army well. They did not make me popular with my family. In the Rowan family, I had a different job. I was the dependable one. I drove through sleet when somebody needed help moving. I handled hospital forms. I fixed the leaking sink at my sister's house, then listened while Preston explained why the wrench I had used was not the one a professional would have chosen. When my father's health began to fail, I arranged appointments, reviewed medication lists, and drove him to the cardiologist. Denise brought casseroles and photographs. Preston brought advice. Nobody said this arrangement out loud. Families rarely issue written orders. They simply repeat a pattern until everyone mistakes it for character. Caleb can handle it. Caleb does not mind. Caleb has a pension. Caleb is used to sacrifice. The last statement was true. The rest became less true every year. My father, Walter Rowan, understood that before I did. He had been an Army aviation mechanic in Germany as a young man. When he came home to Ohio, he bought 2 used lathes, rented a cinder block building outside Dayton, and started making small precision parts for commercial aircraft. He never became a wealthy man in the way Preston defined wealth. He wore the same brown work jacket for 20 years and packed his lunch in a dented steel box. But Rowan Precision Works grew from 2 lathes and 1 stubborn mechanic into a company with 118 employees, a modern inspection lab, and customers in aviation, medical equipment, and industrial controls. The shop was loud, hot in July, and colder than good sense in January. I loved it. As a boy, I swept metal chips into piles that sparkled like fish scales. Dad taught me to read a micrometer before he let me drive. He would place a finished part in my palm and ask what I saw. I usually described the shape. He would shake his head and say, "Look again. A part is not what it looks like. A part is what it can survive." That sentence followed me into the Army. It followed me through deployments, budget fights, and one memorable inspection in Kuwait involving 12 generators that existed perfectly on paper and nowhere else. It also followed me home. My sister Denise never loved the shop. She disliked the oil smell and the way metal dust settled on her shoes. That was not a moral failure. She became a high school principal and was good at it. She could settle a hallway full of angry parents with one raised eyebrow. She liked order, schedules, and respectable explanations. What she did love was being Walter Rowan's daughter, especially after the company became the sort of place local business magazines wrote about. Denise is 3 years older than I am. She has always believed that keeping peace is the same thing as being fair. In practice, that usually meant asking the quieter person to absorb the louder person's behavior. I was often the quieter person. Preston was never quiet. He owned Peregrine Aero Supply, a regional aircraft parts distributor he had built through aggressive borrowing and 3 acquisitions. He spoke in forecasts. He called debt leverage. He called layoffs efficiency. He called every request he made an opportunity for the other person. At family gatherings, he liked to tell me that the military had insulated me from the real economy. I would look at him and remember the years when I had to move fuel, food, and repair parts across countries, where a late truck could become a casualty report. Then I would let him finish. Correcting Preston only made him use more words. Dad died in March, a little after his 89th birthday. His heart had been weakening for years, but his mind remained exact. 2 weeks before he died, he corrected a nurse who wrote the wrong month on a medication chart. He did it gently, then asked for his reading glasses so he could check the rest. The will was read in a conference room above Marisol Vega's law office. Marisol had handled Dad's business matters for nearly 20 years. She placed 3 folders on the table and explained the distribution without drama. Denise received 2 rental properties, Dad's municipal bond account, and 29% of Rowan Precision in non-voting shares. The combined appraised value was substantial. Dad had not disinherited her. He had made sure she would be secure. I received his 51% block of voting shares. The remaining 20% was already owned by 3 senior managers through a long-standing incentive plan. That meant I held control, but not the right to treat the company like a checking account. The bylaws required board review for major asset sales, and Dad's shareholder agreement gave the company a first chance to buy any controlling block before it could leave the existing ownership group. Preston listened to all of this with his arms folded. When Marisol finished, he asked whether my shares could be transferred to Denise. Marisol said they could be transferred by me, subject to the company documents. Preston smiled. "Then this is easy," he said. It was the first time I understood that he had arrived at the reading with a plan already completed in his head. My consent was not part of the plan. It was a formality he expected to collect. Denise asked why Dad had not divided the voting shares evenly. Marisol handed her a letter Dad had authorized her to read aloud. It said he had separated economic value from operating control because a factory with 118 paychecks could not be governed like a family potluck. He had chosen the person with experience in regulated procurement, long-range planning, and institutional responsibility. He also wrote that Denise's inheritance was designed to protect her without forcing her to run a business she had never wanted to run. Denise heard judgment where Dad had tried to provide structure. Preston heard an obstacle. In the parking lot afterward, he told me the arrangement was temporary. "You will sign the voting block over once the emotion settles down," he said. I asked what emotion he meant. "Grief," he said, though he had not visited Dad during the final 3 weeks of his life. I told him I was not discussing the shares in a parking lot. He gave me the smile he used when he believed a negotiation had merely been delayed. "Fine, we will do it properly." For the next 17 months, properly arrived in many disguises. There were family lunches about legacy. There were emails about tax efficiency. There was a Christmas conversation in which Preston suggested that Denise should hold my voting proxy in case I was recalled to some vague military duty, even though I had been retired for more than 3 years. There was a packet from his accountant showing how a consolidated family ownership structure could create flexibility. The word flexibility appeared 11 times. The word employees appeared once in a footnote about labor cost. I answered very little. Silence made Preston confident. He mistook it for indecision. Denise mistook it for my usual willingness to be worn down. A few relatives mistook it for secrecy and began offering advice I had not requested. What I was actually doing was completing work my father had begun before his death. I did not tell Denise. I did not tell Preston. I did not tell the cousins who suddenly wanted to take me to breakfast. I met with lawyers, valuation specialists, the company board, and an independent retirement plan trustee. I reviewed cash flow, debt capacity, pension rules, and every paragraph of the shareholder agreement. I carried a small green field notebook, the same kind I had used in the army, and wrote down questions in block letters. Who benefits? Who bears the risk? What happens when the optimistic case fails? That had taught me to ask one more question. What can this survive? By the time Denise called to offer me a birthday dinner, I knew exactly what the shares could survive and exactly what they could not. The invitation came in late August. Denise sounded almost cheerful. "Just family," she said, "nothing complicated. A decent meal for once. You only turned 61 one time." I reminded her that this statement applied to every age. She said, "That is the army humor people warned me about." The dinner was set for a Saturday night at a restaurant in downtown Dayton that occupied an old railway office. The main room had tall windows, dark wood, and framed photographs of early aircraft hanging between brass lamps. Preston reserved a private dining room in the back. He invited 26 people, including relatives I had not seen since Dad's funeral, 2 of Denise's former colleagues, Preston's accountant, and a local banker I recognized from a Chamber of Commerce event. That guest list told me more than the invitation did. I sat in my truck across the street for 5 minutes before going inside. On the passenger seat was my green notebook. I did not need it for dinner, but I had brought it anyway. Old habits are portable shelter. The first hour was pleasant enough to make a reasonable person doubt his instincts. Denise had found photographs from my commissioning ceremony, my first promotion, and the day Dad visited me at Fort Belvoir. She arranged them on a side table beside a sheet cake decorated with a small American flag and a badly drawn army seal. My cousin Harold gave me a bottle of bourbon. My Aunt Joan asked whether I missed wearing the uniform. A nephew I barely knew wanted to hear about helicopters. Denise gave a toast. She spoke about service and steadiness. She said I had always been the person the family could count on. Everyone nodded. There are compliments that feel like appreciation. There are others that sound like job descriptions. I thanked her anyway. Preston was unusually attentive. He refilled water glasses. He asked about the volunteer work. I had begun with veterans entering skilled trades. He even listened to the answer. Every few minutes he touched the blue leather folio beside his chair as if checking that it was still there. I noticed because I had seen that folio before. He brought it to Dad's funeral. He brought it to the will reading. He carried it through family meetings the way some men carry a badge. The leather was embossed with his initials, and the brass clasp made a small click whenever he opened it. Dad once called it Preston's portable weather system because pressure entered the room whenever the clasp moved. We had finished the main course when I heard that click. Preston stood. The waiter was collecting plates, and for a moment the young man looked uncertain whether he should continue. Preston waved him away with the generous authority of someone dismissing staff in a room he had rented for 3 hours. I want to take 5 minutes, he said, to talk about Walter's legacy and how we protect it. Nobody asked him to sit down. He removed a stack of papers and handed copies down both sides of the table. The cover page read, Rowan Family Continuity Plan. Beneath the title was a photograph of Dad standing beside the oldest lathe in the shop. Preston had taken the picture from the company website. My sister looked at me with a careful expression. That was when I knew she had seen the packet before. Preston began with history. He described Dad's courage, the company's reputation, and the sacred obligation to keep ownership in the bloodline. Then he shifted to risk. He said I was retired, unmarried, and frequently away. He said industrial companies needed active family leadership. He said the market was consolidating. He said waiting could destroy value. Most of those statements were either incomplete or irrelevant. They were arranged well. The plan proposed that I give Denise an irrevocable voting proxy for my entire block. A second document granted Peregrine Aero Supply the exclusive right to negotiate a strategic combination with Rowan Precision. A third authorized Preston to present combined financial information to lenders and investors. The signature tabs were already attached. He had marked mine in yellow. Denise spoke before I did. This does not take anything away from you, she said. You would still receive the economic benefit. It simply puts the family on one side. I looked at the paper. Under the proposal, I would keep distributions but lose every meaningful vote. Preston would direct negotiations. Denise would hold legal control, but the agreement required her to follow the recommendations of a transition committee chaired by her husband. That is not one side, I said. That is one chair. Preston laughed. A few people joined him because they were unsure what else to do. Caleb, he said, you are reading this like a hostile contract. It is a contract. It is a framework. Frameworks have signatures. The local banker stopped smiling. Preston placed both hands on the table. He had not been drinking much, but his face was flushed. We all respect your service. We all respect what you did for Walter. But this company belongs to the family. It should not be controlled by one man who has spent most of his life somewhere else. I had heard versions of that sentence since the will reading. It left out the summers I worked at the shop, the years I reviewed Dad's expansion plans from overseas, and the months I slept in a chair beside him after his first surgery. It also left out the simple legal fact that the shares did belong to one man because Dad had chosen that arrangement. A cousin near the far end said perhaps I should at least consider a temporary proxy. A former neighbor said businesses were too important for family disagreements. Denise's old colleague said shared ownership might help everyone heal. The advice moved around the table like a collection plate. Then Denise used the sentence our mother used whenever she wanted me to surrender, without calling it surrender. You have always been the strong one, she said. You can afford to be generous. I looked at her for a long moment. Being strong is not the same as being available for extraction. I did not say that aloud. Not yet. Preston slid the original signature packet toward me. He placed a pen on top of it. "Let us finish this tonight," he said. "No more delays. Sign the proxy, authorize the talks, and give your sister what Dad should have given her in the first place." The room became very quiet. At the side table, the candles on the cake had begun to lean in the heat from the warming tray. The little army seal was missing half a star. I remember those details because the mind sometimes records ordinary things when something permanent is happening. I put my hand on the blue folder. Preston relaxed by half an inch. Denise exhaled. Somebody near the door whispered, "Good." I pushed the folder back. "Workers own it," I said. Preston blinked once. "What did you say?" "I sold my voting shares to an employee ownership plan. The transaction closed last Monday. The plan holds the shares for the people who work at Rowan Precision." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then every reaction arrived at once. Denise said my name sharply. Harold swore under his breath. Preston's accountant began flipping through his copy of the proposal as if a page might explain the problem. The banker folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. Preston did not look angry at first. He looked frightened. That was the detail I carried home. He reached for the folder, missed the edge, and knocked his wine glass against his plate. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth and touched the bottom corner of the continuity plan. He pulled the papers away too quickly, leaving a red handprint across Dad's photograph. "You cannot have done that," he said. "I did, without a family vote. My shares did not require a family vote." Denise leaned toward me. "You sold Dad's company to strangers." "No. I sold a controlling block to a qualified plan for the employees. The same people who've been making the parts, meeting payroll, and keeping customers for years." Preston found his volume. "Do you understand what this does to us? There was no reason for the transfer to do anything to him. He did not work at Rowan Precision. He owned no voting shares. He had no contract with the company. Yet his question came out with the force of a man watching a bridge collapse under his own car." I looked at the banker. He was studying Preston now, not me. That was the second detail I carried home. Denise stood. Her chair struck the wall behind her. "You had no right to hide this from me." "I had every legal right," I said. "You still own every non-voting share Dad left you. Nothing of yours was sold. This affects my future. It affects the control Preston expected to receive. Those are not the same thing." Her face changed. Not because she agreed, but because the distinction had reached a place she had been avoiding. Preston pointed at me across the table. "You will reverse it." "No. We will challenge it. You should speak to a lawyer before you make promises on one." He took one step around the table. My nephew rose halfway from his seat, uncertain whether he was about to intervene. I remained seated. After 34 years, around officers, contractors, and men who confused volume with authority, I was not impressed by a man in an expensive jacket standing beside a ruined plate of salmon. Preston lowered his voice. "You have no idea what you just destroyed." There it was again. Not the family. Not Dad's wishes. Not Denise's inheritance. Something else. I stood, placed enough cash beside my plate to cover my meal and the server's trouble, and picked up my coat. Denise asked whether I was really going to leave my own birthday dinner. I said the birthday part appeared to be over. Then I walked out. My phone began vibrating before I reached the parking garage. By the time I arrived home, I had 14 missed calls, 9 text messages, and 1 voicemail from Preston that lasted almost 4 minutes. I listened to the first 30 seconds. He said I had acted recklessly. He said serious people had relied on an orderly family transition. He said commitments had been made. Then he caught himself and changed the word commitments to conversations. I stopped the message and wrote both words in my green notebook. Commitments. Conversations. The difference between them was going to matter. For 2 days, the family tried direct pressure. Denise called in the morning, at lunch, and after dinner. Her first messages accused me of humiliating her. The later ones asked for the name of the trustee, the purchase price, and a copy of every agreement. Preston's messages were shorter. He wanted an emergency meeting. He wanted the closing documents. He wanted me to confirm that the employee plan had not yet funded the transaction. That last question was useful. A person interested in family legacy asks who owns the company. A person interested in financing asks whether the money has funded. I answered neither of them. On the third day, they stopped calling and began visiting other people. Preston drove to Rowan Precision before the first shift ended. Luis Ortega, the plant manager, met him in the lobby. Luis had worked for Dad since he was 19 and had the calm manner of a man who had solved real emergencies at 2 in the morning. He listened while Preston demanded access to the corporate minute book, the equipment schedule, and the new capitalization table. Then Luis told him he was not an officer, director, employee, or authorized representative of the company. Preston said he was family. Louise said family was not a security credential. The receptionist later told me that Preston stood in the parking lot for nearly half an hour making calls. He photographed the building. He photographed the loading docks. He even photographed the sign near the employee entrance that read, "Built by the people who work here." Dad had installed that sign after a profitable year. Preston had always called it sentimental. Now he treated it like evidence. Denise contacted Marisol and requested the entire probate file. She was entitled to the documents that concerned her, and Marisol provided them. Nothing in the file helped. Dad's will was clear. His doctors had documented his capacity. The shareholder agreement had been amended years earlier, not during his final illness. My shares carried no restriction requiring family consent. 2 cousins called the county recorder, looking for a deed transfer. There was none because the factory real estate had not been sold. Rowan Precision still owned its building and machines. What changed was the owner of my stock, and private company stock transfers do not appear in county property records. The less they found, the more frantic Preston became. I spent that Tuesday at my kitchen table with the green notebook, the birthday packet, and old emails Dad had saved. I began with the same method I had used on troubled army programs. Build the timeline, separate statements from documents, mark every place where urgency appeared before explanation. The continuity plan said Peregrine and Rowan Precision would combine after a 90-day review. It also said the combined company could support expanded credit facilities based on a preliminary asset value of $16,800,000. That number bothered me. Rowan Precision's public marketing material did not list asset values. The company's audited statements were private. Denise received annual shareholder reports, but even those grouped equipment into broad categories. The exact figure in Preston's packet was close to an internal insurance valuation prepared 11 months earlier. 3 years before Dad died, Preston had introduced him to an insurance broker after a storm damaged part of the roof. Dad allowed Preston to receive an equipment schedule for the limited purpose of obtaining a competing quote. The quote went nowhere, but the old schedule would have given him values and serial numbers for most of the shop. His questions at Thanksgiving now looked like an attempt to update what he already had. I opened my notebook to a page from the previous Thanksgiving. Preston had cornered Dad's former controller beside the dessert table and asked whether the new 5-axis mills were owned outright. He asked how much unused acreage sat behind the west parking lot. He asked whether the company had completed an environmental review when it bought the adjacent parcel. I had written the questions down because they sounded like due diligence. At the time, Preston said he was merely curious. Curiosity rarely arrives with an asset checklist. I called Joyce Malik, a retired Army finance officer I had known for 20 years. Joyce did not work for any company involved, but she understood commercial lending and had no patience for vague nouns. I described the dinner without giving her confidential company information. She listened, then asked one question. Did he use the phrase "serious people relied on this"? Yes. Then somebody has a term sheet, she said. Maybe not a funded loan, but a conditional commitment. Men like Preston do not say reliance unless they expect to argue damages later. I asked what a lender would need. Control, she said. A clean capitalization table. Authority to pledge assets. Probably a board path. If his own company is weak, he needs a stronger balance sheet to stand behind the new money. I looked again at the proposal. My voting proxy gave Denise control. The transition committee gave Preston practical direction. The strategic combination clause allowed him to present consolidated information to lenders. It was not a family plan with financing attached. It was a financing plan wrapped in family language. That afternoon, Marisol called. She had received an inquiry from counsel representing a private credit fund in Chicago. The fund wanted confirmation that I had approved a pending transfer of control to Denise and a planned combination with Peregrine Aero Supply. I had approved neither. Marisol said the fund's lawyer had attached a single-page consent bearing an electronic image of my signature. I felt the room become smaller. Did you sign anything for Preston in the last 2 years? She asked. No. Did you send him a signed document he could have copied? I thought about tax forms, hospital releases, funeral arrangements, and the endless paper that follows a death. Then I remembered a family charitable contribution form Denise had circulated after Dad's funeral. Each of us signed a separate authorization so the memorial gifts could be acknowledged in the family name. Preston had collected the forms. I told Marisol, "Do not accuse anyone yet," she said. "We have an image, not a forensic conclusion. I am asking the fund to preserve what it received. Nolan Price, the employee plan trustee, is doing the same." Nolan was the independent fiduciary who had approved the purchase of my shares. In ordinary language, that meant he was the person legally responsible for deciding whether the transaction was fair to the employees. He did not work for me. He did not work for Rowan Precision. He did not care about Rowan family harmony. His duty ran to the workers whose retirement plan now held the stock. That independence had irritated Preston even before he knew the transfer was complete. He was accustomed to negotiations where every person at the table could be pressured through a relationship. Nolan had no relationship to pressure. Marisol said the lender wanted a conference call. Denise and Preston had already retained a lawyer and demanded to participate. She recommended that we all speak once, on a recorded line, with no side conversations. I agreed. The call was scheduled for Friday morning, 6 days after the birthday dinner. Until then, Marisol told me not to contact the fund, not to contact Preston's company, and not to speculate with relatives. Preserve every message. Make no public accusation. Let the documents speak in the order they were created. That advice sounded familiar. In the army, when an investigation begins, the least useful person is the one who races ahead of the evidence because he likes his theory. I spent Thursday evening reviewing the transaction that had put us here. The numbers told part of the story. Peregrine Aero Supply had grown quickly during a period when aircraft maintenance companies were rebuilding inventory. Preston borrowed to buy 2 smaller distributors. He paid prices based on optimistic demand, then carried too much slow-moving stock when orders softened. According to the information later shared through counsel, Peregrine owed $9,800,000 across bank debt, equipment loans, and private notes. A balloon payment of $3,400,000 was due at the end of the following month. Preston had personally guaranteed a large portion of it. The Chicago Fund was considering a $12 million rescue facility. The money would refinance the balloon payment, provide working capital, and buy time. But the fund would not lend against Peregrine alone. It wanted control of Rowan Precision and a first claim on the combined company's hard assets. Rowan Precision had no reason to accept that risk. It was profitable. It carried manageable debt. Its machines were busy. Its employees had built value over decades. Preston's solution was to obtain my voting proxy, use Denise's shares to present family alignment, negotiate a combination, and then pledge the stronger company to save the weaker one. He needed my signature before the lender completed due diligence. That explained the guest list. The banker at dinner was not there to celebrate me. Preston wanted a witness from the financial community to see family consent performed in public. The relatives were not merely pressure, they were scenery for a transaction. He had expected me to sign because I had spent most of my life doing what the family called generous. He had not planned for the possibility that I had finally learned the difference between generosity and surrender. To understand why I had transferred the shares, you have to understand the last serious project my father and I worked on together. It began in January, 2 months before he died. Ohio had been locked in a week of hard cold. The shop roof cracked at night as the steel contracted, and the morning shift arrived wearing insulated coveralls under their work clothes. Dad had not been well enough to come in regularly, but that Tuesday he insisted I drive him there before sunrise. We entered through the employee door. The first shift had not started. Only the inspection lab was lit, a white square behind glass at the far end of the floor. Dad stood beside the old manual lathe he had bought when he opened the business. It had not produced a customer part in years, but he refused to remove it. He ran his hand along the worn control wheel. Preston was here last week, he said. I knew. Luis had mentioned it. Dad asked whether I knew what Preston wanted. He says he wants to understand the company. Dad gave me a look that had corrected me since childhood. He wants to understand what can be borrowed against. Then he opened the top drawer of the old tool cabinet and removed a brass micrometer wrapped in a gray shop rag. It was the first precision instrument he had bought with his own money. The finish was worn where his thumb had rested thousands of times. He placed it in my hand. Your niece Maya can still read one of these, he said. Maya was Denise and Preston's only child. She had disappointed Preston by enlisting in the Air Force instead of joining his company after college. At the time of Dad's illness, she was a technical sergeant supervising aircraft maintenance crews in Germany. She called Dad every Sunday. They discussed tolerances, worn bearings, and which coffee on base was least offensive. She reads them better than I do, I said. Good, keep it safe for now. I asked why he did not mail it to her. Because I am not finished with it yet. He set a thick envelope on the tool cabinet. Inside was a feasibility study prepared by an employee ownership advisor. Dad had commissioned it the previous summer without telling the family. The study examined whether his voting shares could eventually be sold to an employee stock ownership plan. I knew the general idea. An employee stock ownership plan is a retirement plan that can hold shares of the company for employees. Workers do not write personal checks for the stock. The plan acquires it through a carefully structured transaction. and shares are allocated to employee accounts over time. Because employees are the beneficiaries, an independent trustee must review the value and decide whether the deal is fair. Dad had studied every page. "I am not giving you a company," he said. "I am giving you a decision." I asked whether he had already made it. "No. If I make it now, Preston will say I was confused or frightened or controlled by you. He may say that anyway. But the cleaner path is to leave the voting block where the will puts it and let you decide after I am gone." That was not an easy gift. Dad understood that ownership creates responsibility before it creates freedom. He also understood that transferring control to employees would change Denise's expectations, my financial future, and the direction of a company he had built over more than half a century. "Why me?" I asked. "Because Denise wants everyone calm. Preston wants everyone committed. You are the only one who keeps asking what happens if they are wrong." He tapped the feasibility study. "And because you have spent your career protecting institutions from the people who arrive with urgent plans and borrowed confidence." We walked slowly through the shop as the lights came on. Dad greeted employees by name. He knew whose son had joined the Navy, whose wife was recovering from surgery, whose mortgage rate had reset at a bad time. The company was not perfect. There had been layoffs in a recession years earlier. There had been arguments over wages and overtime. Dad could be stubborn enough to make a door hinge tired, but he never forgot that the machines existed to support people, not the other way around. Near the loading dock, he stopped to catch his breath. 118 people, he said. Preston sees $16 million in equipment. I see 118 kitchens where somebody expects groceries. He told me about Preston's questions, equipment serial numbers, property boundaries, insurance values, customer concentration, whether the company debt had restrictions on a change of control. These were not illegal questions. They were simply too specific for a man claiming casual family interest. Dad had also seen a draft presentation on Denise's kitchen counter. The title was Peregrine Rowan Growth Platform. A page beneath it showed 3 arrows. One pointed from Rowan Precision's assets to a box labeled refinancing capacity. He did not take the document. He did not confront Preston. He memorized the title and came home. I asked why he had waited to tell me. "Because suspicion is not proof," he said. "And because I wanted to see whether he would ever ask about the people." He never did. Then Dad said the sentence that made the rest of my decision possible. "Do not preserve my name by sacrificing my workers. If the choice is between a Rowan on the door and steady hands at the machines, choose the hands." We stood there while the first shift bell rang. That was the last morning he entered the shop. After his death, I put the feasibility study in my green notebook case and did nothing for 3 months. Grief is not a good transaction advisor. Neither is anger. During those months, Preston increased the pressure. That made me suspicious. But suspicion alone was not enough. I needed to know whether employee ownership was financially sound, whether the company could support the purchase without starving operations, and whether the plan protected workers rather than using their retirement accounts as decoration. I met Marisol first. She warned me that an employee ownership transaction was not a ceremonial gift. The shares had to be valued. The trustee had to be independent. The company had to demonstrate that it could meet its obligations after the sale. Every conflict had to be disclosed. A family expectation is not a property right, she told me. But employee retirement money is protected by real duties. If you do this, you do it cleanly. Then I met Nolan Price. Nolan was a former benefits lawyer with a face that revealed almost nothing. He asked harder questions than Preston ever had. Was the company too dependent on 3 customers? Could it survive an aviation downturn? Was Dad's management team deep enough? Would I accept a lower price if the independent valuation came in below the family estimate? Would I remain involved after the sale? I told him I would accept the independent price, that I wanted no management position, and that I would serve only as an unpaid advisor for a limited transition if the board requested it. Nolan said his client was not me. I know. His client was not Dad's memory. I know. His client was the workforce. That is why I am here. For the first time in the process, he almost smiled. The valuation took months. Specialists inspected the machines, reviewed contracts, studied cash flow, and discounted every optimistic assumption. The final value of my voting block was less than Preston had implied at dinner and more than I needed for a secure retirement. The plan bought my shares with a combination of bank financing and a seller note. I did not receive a suitcase of cash. I received part of the price at closing and a long-term promise paid from company performance. That meant I still carried risk. If the company failed, I could lose money. I considered that appropriate. I also directed $2,400,000 from the closing proceeds into the Walter Rowan Veterans in Trades Fund. The fund would pay for tools, certification courses, and apprenticeships for veterans and military spouses entering precision manufacturing. Rowan Precision agreed to host participants, but an outside committee would select them. I had no authority to reserve places for relatives or friends. I kept the rest. That matters to say plainly. I did not give away every dollar and ascend into sainthood. I had served for 34 years. I wanted a modest house, health security, and enough money to visit the people I loved without studying airfare for 3 weeks. Dad would have called that common sense. My decision was not pure sacrifice. It was stewardship, self-interest, anger, caution, and love, arranged into something I could defend in daylight. The closing occurred 5 days before my birthday dinner. Nolan signed for the plan. I signed as seller. The company updated its stock ledger. The voting rights moved immediately. The employees would receive formal notice the following Monday after required internal communications were ready. That was why I had not announced anything publicly. It was not a scheme to embarrass Denise. It was ordinary transaction discipline. Preston scheduled the dinner for Saturday. He was 5 days too late. There was one more part of Dad's plan I did not know about. Before he died, he left Marisol a sealed letter with 2 instructions. The first said she was to give it to me only after the employee plan owned the voting block. The second said I was not to open the smaller envelope inside it. That envelope was for Maya. At the time of the lawyer call, I did not know either envelope existed. Friday morning, I sat at the same kitchen table where I had built the timeline. The green notebook lay open beside the phone. Marisol called at 9. Before I connect everyone, she said, "I need to ask you directly. Is the signature on the consent yours?" She sent the page through a secure message. I opened it on my laptop. The document was titled Family Control Authorization. It stated that I approved transferring my voting shares to Denise and authorized Preston to negotiate financing based on the assets of a future combined company. At the bottom was an electronic image of my signature. The image was mine. The authorization was not. I recognized the signature from the memorial contribution form. My pen had skipped slightly through the letter R because the table at the funeral home had a rough surface. The same skip appeared on the consent. "I did not sign this document," I said. Marisol asked whether I was certain. Completely. She connected the call. Denise was there. Preston was there. Their attorney, Charles Weller, introduced himself. Nolan joined for the employee plan. A lawyer for the Chicago Credit Fund listened, but said little. Marisol stated that the call was being recorded with everyone's consent. Preston began before she finished. "We want the sale unwound immediately," he said. Caleb lacked authority to make a transfer that damaged existing family shareholders. Marisol answered with the first layer. Caleb owned the voting block outright. The will granted it without a family approval condition. The shareholder agreement permitted the sale after the company's right to purchase was addressed. The board process was completed. The stock ledger was updated. The employee plan now owned the shares. Denise said she had never been notified. Marisol explained that notice to a non-voting shareholder was not a condition of Caleb's transfer. Denise's shares remained untouched. Charles asked whether the plan would voluntarily reverse the purchase to avoid litigation. Nolan answered with the second layer. "The plan is not a Rowan family member," he said. "It is a retirement plan holding assets for employees. I cannot give away those assets because relatives dislike the result. My duty is to the participants." Preston said, "Everyone had a price." Nolan replied, "That sentence is one reason independent trustees exist." Charles quickly asked his client to let counsel speak. For several minutes, the lawyers discussed procedure. Undue influence, capacity, disclosure, valuation. Each argument reached the same wall. Dad's capacity had been documented. I had acted after his death. The price came from independent valuation. The board had reviewed the financing. The employees had received a controlling interest through a regulated retirement structure. Then Preston attacked the timing. He said I had rushed the deal to defeat an existing family agreement. Marisol asked him to identify the agreement. He said the continuity plan had been under discussion for months. I said discussion was not consent. He said serious financial commitments had been made in reliance on the transfer. Marisol paused. "What commitments, Mr. Holt?" Charles said his client did not need to answer. Preston answered anyway. The shares were already on the collateral schedule. That was the third layer. Nobody spoke for 2 full seconds. Then Denise asked, "What collateral schedule?" Preston said she knew about the Peregrine refinancing. She said she knew he was refinancing his company. She did not know he had listed Rowan Precision. Charles told both of them to stop talking. The fund's lawyer entered the conversation for the first time. He said the proposed credit facility had been conditioned on a completed change of control. verified authority to pledge Rowan Precision's assets, and acceptable documentation. No facility had funded. The fund had relied on representations that family approval was complete and closing was imminent. Denise's voice changed. Preston, did you tell them Caleb had agreed? He said the family had always understood what would happen. That is not what I asked. He did not answer. Marisol moved to the fourth layer. She described the family control authorization. She said the credit fund had preserved the original electronic file and the email that transmitted it. She said I denied signing it. She also said the signature image appeared identical to one on a memorial contribution form collected by Preston after Dad's funeral. Charles asked everyone to stop making accusations. Marisol said no accusation had been made. A disputed document had been identified. The fund was entitled to investigate who created and sent it. Then Nolan mentioned the equipment schedule. The lender package included serial numbers for 23 machines at Rowan Precision. Those numbers were not public. The schedule also used the exact internal insurance value I had noticed in the birthday packet. I turned pages in my green notebook. The previous Thanksgiving, I had written down 6 serial numbers Preston asked Dad's former controller to confirm. I read them aloud. Every one appeared on the lender schedule. Preston said that proved nothing. He had advised family businesses for years. He collected information. Luis had already provided a statement saying no one at Rowan Precision authorized him to collect it. The fund's lawyer said its internal review was now formal. All pending activity was suspended. No one was to destroy messages, drafts, or devices related to the proposed transaction. Preston's anger disappeared. Fear took its place. He asked whether the fund was accusing him of fraud. The lawyer said the fund was preserving evidence and determining what representations had been made, by whom, and with what authority. Charles requested a private break with his clients. Before the line went silent, I heard Denise say one sentence. You used Dad's funeral form. It was not loud. It did not need to be. That was the emotional center of the entire story for me. Not the failed loan. Not Preston's panic. It was my sister realizing that the man beside her had taken a signature collected during our father's funeral and turned it into a tool for his own debt. If you have ever been called selfish because you refuse to finance another person's emergency, leave the word boundary in the comments and subscribe for the next story. Sometimes the most important act of loyalty is refusing to help someone hide what they have done. The call resumed 11 minutes later. Charles did most of the talking. He withdrew the demand for an immediate reversal pending review. He stated that Preston disputed any suggestion of intentional misconduct. He asked for copies of the documents through counsel. Marisol agreed to an orderly exchange. Then, she set a boundary. Any attempt to interfere with the employee plan, pressure company staff, or contact customers with false claims about ownership would be documented and addressed. Any challenge to Dad's will would be defended with his medical records, lawyer notes, and the timeline of amendments made while he was healthy. Denise asked whether there was any way for her to obtain voting control later. Nolan answered. She could make a bona fide offer if the plan ever chose to sell, but the plan had no current intention to do so. More important, she could not compel a sale merely because she was related to the founder. A family name is not a call option, he said. Preston asked what would happen to the rescue loan. The fund's lawyer said the proposed facility was suspended and likely to be withdrawn. Likely, Preston repeated. No one answered him. The call ended without goodbyes. I remained at the table with my hand on the green notebook. I expected satisfaction. I had spent months protecting the company from the exact risk Dad feared. The plan had worked. The shares were safe. The workers were not going to wake up owned by Peregrine's lenders. What I felt was heavier. My father had been right about Preston. That did not feel like winning. It felt like discovering rot in a beam after the roof had already begun to sag. Marisol stayed on the line. You handled that well, she said. I told her I had said almost nothing. That is often what handling it well looks like. Then she told me about the sealed letter. The transfer condition had been satisfied. I could collect it whenever I was ready. I asked what was inside. She said she did not know. Dad had sealed it himself. For once, I did not try to solve the next part before it arrived. The formal consequences arrived more slowly than the family expected and faster than Preston could afford. The Chicago Fund withdrew its proposed credit facility the following week. Its letter did not accuse anyone of a crime. It said the underwriting assumptions were unreliable, authority over the proposed collateral had not been established, and material representations required further review. Those sentences were enough. Peregrine's existing bank learned that the rescue financing would not close. The bank did what banks do when optimism stops being an asset. It reviewed covenants, inventory values, and personal guarantees. Suppliers who had extended generous terms shortened them. 2 customers shifted orders because they did not want parts trapped in a financial dispute. The $3,400,000 balloon payment remained due. Preston's problem had never been caused by my stock transfer. The transfer merely removed the false solution he had built around it. That distinction mattered to me, especially when relatives began saying I had destroyed his company. I answered one cousin and then stopped answering the rest. Peregrine was damaged by debt it chose, acquisitions it overpaid for, inventory it could not move, and representations its owner made. Rowan Precision was not an organ waiting to be harvested. The disputed consent went through forensic review. The electronic file had been created on a laptop assigned to Peregrine's executive office. The signature image had been pasted into the document from a scanned page. The transmission came from Preston's account. His lawyer said an administrative employee might have assembled the package from materials Preston believed were authorized. The fund did not accept that explanation, but it also did not publish its conclusions. It referred the matter to its internal fraud group and outside counsel. I provided a statement and the original memorial form. After that, I let the process move without commentary. People often expect stories like this to end with handcuffs. Real financial disputes usually end in conference rooms, demand letters, insurance notices, and years of arguments over intent. I do not know whether a prosecutor ever reviewed the file. No one asked me to testify in a criminal case. I will not claim an outcome that did not happen. What did happen was serious enough. Peregrine entered a court-supervised restructuring before the year ended. Preston lost operational control to a restructuring officer. The warehouse he had bought during the expansion was sold. Several employees lost their jobs, which gave me no pleasure. They had not created the deception. They were people standing under a roof, built by somebody else's decisions. I contributed anonymously to a local emergency fund for displaced workers. I did not tell Denise. I did not tell the family. Charity becomes theater when the giver needs an audience. Rowan Precision moved in the opposite direction. On the Monday after the birthday dinner, Luis gathered all 3 shifts in the shop. Nolan explained the employee ownership plan in plain language. The company was not giving every worker a tradable certificate. Shares would be allocated to retirement accounts over time, according to plan rules. Employees would gain economic ownership, and the plan trustee would exercise the voting rights. Day-to-day management still belonged to the leadership team and board. There was skepticism. There should have been. One machinist asked whether employee ownership meant wage cuts. Another asked whether the seller note would drain cash. A quality inspector asked what happened if the company lost a major customer. Nolan answered every question, including the ones that made the transaction look less heroic. Luis later called me. They trust the deal more because nobody called it magic, he said. Dad would have approved. Luis was quiet for a moment. Your father used to say, you can replace a spindle, you cannot replace trust on the floor. I had forgotten that one. The plan did not turn Rowan Precision into paradise. We still had late orders, a coolant leak, and a customer audit that kept 6 managers awake for a week. Employee ownership did not eliminate market risk or human foolishness. It changed who benefited when the company did well and who held the controlling interest when outsiders came shopping. That was enough. Denise did not speak to me for 5 weeks. Then she called on a Wednesday evening while I was repairing a loose hinge on my back gate. Her voice sounded tired rather than angry. Did you know about the second mortgage? She asked. I set down the screwdriver. No. She told me Preston had opened a home equity line against their house. She had signed the documents, but he described the line as temporary liquidity for one acquisition. Most of the money had gone to cover interest and supplier payments at Peregrine. He had also directed $180,000 from a retirement rollover into a private note tied to the company. She had signed that too. I asked whether she had independent counsel. No. Get some... She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. That sounds like an order. It is a recommendation from a brother who has already watched one consent page move farther than it was supposed to. She became quiet. He told me, your shares were certain, she said. Not possible. Certain. He said Walter had left them to you because you were the cleanest person to hold them until the companies combined. He said you knew the plan and were making him wait because you wanted better terms. None of that was true. I know that now. She asked why. I had not warned her. That question carried years inside it. I told her the truth. I had warned her that I would not transfer the shares. I had told her Preston's proposal gave him control. I had asked why he needed internal asset information. Each time, she said I was suspicious because the army had trained me to see threats. You did not need another warning from me, I said. You needed a reason to believe one. She began to cry quietly. Denise had cried at Dad's funeral, but that grief had been public and orderly. This was different. This was the sound of a person reviewing old decisions without the protection of a familiar explanation. I did not list her mistakes. She knew them. I also did not tell her everything would be fine. I had no basis for that promise. I said I was sorry she was in pain. I said I would help her find a lawyer and a forensic accountant. I said I would not give her money to cover Preston's business debt, and I would not use Rowan Precision to solve it. She said, I did not ask you to. Not yet, I replied. That answer hurt her. It was also necessary. The next morning, I sent her 3 names. She chose one without asking Preston. It may have been the first important financial decision she had made alone in years. The review found more guarantees, more transfers, and a pattern of information withheld until after signatures were collected. Some documents were valid, and some were disputed. Denise had not been innocent in the simple sense. She had enjoyed the status of Preston's success and accepted explanations that favored the life she wanted. But accepting a comfortable story is not the same as authoring every lie inside it. I tried to hold both facts at once. 5 months after the birthday dinner, Denise moved into one of the rental houses. Dad had left her. She and Preston separated. Their lawyers handled the money. I did not ask for details. She did not volunteer. Preston sent me one final message during that period. He said I had always resented him and had used the employee plan to ruin his family. I read the message twice, then I wrote a response and deleted it. The response explained debt, authority, signatures, and consequences. It was accurate. It would not have changed him. I blocked the number. Maya called from Germany a week later. She had learned about the separation from Denise and about the disputed consent from her father. Preston told her I had stolen the company from the family. Maya asked one question. Do the people at the shop really own the voting shares now? Yes. Good, she said. Then she told me she planned to leave the Air Force the following spring. After 12 years in aircraft maintenance, she wanted to come home and earn a civilian quality certification. She had seen the announcement for the Walter Rowan Veterans in Trades Fund. I told her the selection committee was independent and that I could not influence it. I know, she said. That is why I am applying. Dad would have appreciated the answer. I did not tell her about the smaller sealed envelope. I still had not collected it from Marisol. Some things should arrive in their proper order. The following September, almost 1 year after the dinner, I drove back to Dayton before sunrise. A thin fog sat low over the fields west of town. The radio carried a farm report, a traffic update, and an advertisement for a church fish fry. It was the sort of ordinary Ohio morning Dad trusted more than any ceremony. I stopped first at the cemetery. Dad's grave was beneath a maple near the service road. Someone had placed a small metal airplane beside the stone. I suspected Maya. I cleared leaves from the base, stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets, and gave him the report I would have given if he were sitting across from me. Rowan Precision had finished the year profitably. Customer concentration was down. The seller note was current. The employee plan had allocated its first round of shares. Peregrine's restructuring was still moving through court. Denise was living alone and learning the difference between privacy and secrecy. Maya was home. I did not say I missed him. The entire report said it for me. From the cemetery, I drove to Marisol's office. She had moved downstairs since the will reading, but the waiting room still had the same clock that ran 2 minutes fast. She handed me a large cream envelope sealed with Dad's old company stamp. He made me promise not to mail it, she said. He wanted you to come for it. That sounds like him. Inside was a 6-page letter and a smaller envelope with Maya's name. The brass micrometer lay beneath them, wrapped in the gray shop rag. I read Dad's letter in my truck. Caleb, it began, if Marisol has followed instructions, the voting shares now belong to the employees. That means you made the decision yourself, after I was gone, with enough time to blame no one else. Good. A man ought to own his choices before he asks others to respect them. He wrote that he had considered dividing control between Denise and me. He rejected it because equal division would not produce equal responsibility. It would produce deadlock, and Preston would spend that deadlock selling urgency. He admitted that he had been hard on Denise in ways he regretted. When she chose education instead of the shop, he treated the choice as rejection. Preston later filled that wound with flattery. Dad said he should have apologized more clearly while he had time. Then the letter turned to me. You have a habit of becoming useful whenever affection becomes uncertain, he wrote. The army rewarded that habit. Families can exploit it. Be careful not to confuse being needed with being loved. I stopped reading for a while. The parking lot was filling. A delivery van backed toward the bakery next door. A woman in blue scrubs hurried past with a paper cup. Ordinary life continued while one sentence reached backward through most of mine. Dad wrote that the company was never meant to prove which child loved him more. It was a tool. Tools should do useful work. If employee ownership kept good jobs in the building and trained people who knew the value of exact work, then the tool had served its purpose. He warned me not to romanticize the plan. Employees are people, he wrote. They will disagree, complain, make mistakes, and occasionally elect a fool to something. Ownership does not make anyone noble. It makes consequences harder to export. That sounded so much like him that I laughed in the truck. Near the end, he explained the smaller envelope. Maya had once told him that she wanted to work at Rowan Precision after the Air Force. Preston dismissed the idea. He said ownership should come to her eventually, so there was no reason to start on the floor. Dad disagreed. He told Maya that a family name might open a door, but it could not hold a tolerance. The micrometer was for her if she entered the trade by her own effort. If she chose another life, I was to give it to the first apprentice who reminded me that careful work still mattered. The final paragraph was short. Do not spend the rest of your life standing guard over my decisions. I trusted you because you know when a mission is complete. Finish this one. Then go live somewhere that does not need defending every day. I folded the letter along its old creases. Dad had not left me permission to punish anyone. He had left me permission to stand down. Rowan Precision held its first Veterans Apprenticeship ceremony that afternoon. The first image I remember is the shop floor just after the shift change. The overhead lights came on row by row, reflecting off clean machine enclosures. Employees from all three shifts stood between work cells in safety glasses and company shirts. Above them hung a new sign. It did not say Rowan Family Legacy. It said Precision creates trust. The second image is a line of 12 apprentices beside the inspection lab. There were former soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and 2 military spouses. Each received a tool voucher, a training schedule, and a mentor from the shop. Luis read their names slowly. Nobody rushed the applause. The third image is Maya stepping forward in a plain blue work shirt. She had been selected by the outside committee without my participation. Her Air Force experience qualified her for advanced placement, but she had insisted on completing the same inspection modules as everyone else. She said aircraft did not care who your grandfather was. After the ceremony, I gave her the small envelope. She recognized Dad's handwriting before she opened it. Her hands began to shake. Inside was a note with only 3 sentences. Maya, if you are reading this, you chose the bench before the title. Good. Measure twice, speak plainly, and never sign what you have not read. I unwrapped the micrometer. For a moment she did not take it. Then she closed both hands around the worn brass frame and pressed it against her chest. Denise stood a few feet away. She had come alone. She looked older than she had at my birthday dinner, but also less arranged. There was no careful smile, no prepared explanation. She watched her daughter turn the micrometer's thimble and feel the familiar resistance. Dad saved that for her, Denise said. Yes. I thought he believed the company should stay with blood. I think he believed the work should stay with people who respected it. Denise nodded. Then Maya said something none of us expected. She had received her employee ownership enrollment packet that morning. It explained that once she met the same service requirements as everyone else, shares would begin accumulating in her retirement account. She held up the envelope and smiled. Grandpa got a Rowan back into the company after all, she said. He just made me wait my turn for the shares like everybody else. That was the warmest twist in the entire affair. Preston had tried to turn family ownership into a shortcut around consent. Dad's plan returned ownership to the family through work rather than inheritance, with Preston's own daughter standing in the same line as everyone else. No one had designed that outcome. Not Dad, not me, not the trustee. It happened because Maya chose a different definition of inheritance. Later, the 3 of us sat in the break room with coffee from the machine Dad had complained about for 15 years. The coffee had not improved. Denise told Maya stories about sweeping the shop as a child. Most of them involved trying to escape early. Maya laughed. The laughter did not repair everything, but it made room for repair. When Maya returned to the floor, Denise and I remained at the table. She looked at me and asked how I was doing. Not what I planned to do with the money, not whether I could help with legal bills, not whether the employee plan might sell someday. How I was doing. I told her the answer was complicated. She said she had time, so I gave her the longer answer. We still speak carefully. Trust rebuilt after financial deception is not a bridge you sprint across. It is more like a machine setup. You clean every surface, check every contact point, and verify alignment before applying load. Some days we make progress. Some days, an old sentence puts us back at the beginning. That is honest progress. Preston and I have no relationship now. I hear occasional news through lawyers or relatives. Peregrine emerged from restructuring as a smaller company under different management. He lost the house and much of the reputation he had spent years polishing. I do not celebrate that. I also do not rescue him from it. Rowan Precision continues to operate. Employee ownership has not made every quarter easy, but the people who create the value now participate in it. The Veterans Fund has supported 3 apprenticeship classes. Maya works in quality systems and has developed a reputation for finding problems before they become expensive. Dad would have considered that high praise. As for me, I bought a small place near a lake in southern Indiana. Not an estate, not a legacy property. Just a quiet house with a stubborn dock and enough room for a workbench. I volunteer 2 days a week with the apprenticeship fund and spend the rest learning how to have a life that is not organized around the next emergency. The green notebook sits in my desk. On the final page of the Preston file, I wrote 3 lines. A promise is not ownership. Urgency is not authority. Being useful is not the price of being loved. Then I closed the notebook. For most of my life, I believed strength meant carrying weight without complaint. The army taught me endurance, and my family learned to depend on it. My father's last lesson was different. Strength also means refusing a load that was never yours, especially when someone has already written your name on it. Preston thought the company was a pile of assets waiting to secure his debt. Denise thought peace required me to surrender control. I thought my duty was to keep everyone from breaking apart. All 3 ideas failed inspection. The company was people, peace without truth was delay, and a family held together by one person's surrender was already divided. The most valuable thing Dad left me was not 51% of a factory. It was the discipline to ask what a promise could survive, who carried the risk, and whether consent was real. Those questions saved 118 jobs. They exposed a transaction built on a copied signature. They cost me the family arrangement I had known for decades. They also gave my niece a place to build a future she had earned, gave my sister a chance to make decisions in her own name, and gave me something I had never known how to request: relief. Not the relief of winning, the relief of no longer standing between other adults and the consequences of their choices.